Queen Camilla is accused of diverting crown-linked jewels out of official custody and prepping a historic diamond tiara priced north of $15 million for a covert sale. Princess Anne has assembled paperwork, witnesses, and a sealed directive from Elizabeth II that names her the guardian of these pieces. That is the conflict. That is the charge. Welcome to the broadcast. Before we dive into tonight's developing file, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss critical updates in this unfolding story. The first ripples were dismissed as gossip: a brooch missing from a display, a necklace absent from a scheduled inventory, a tiara no longer available for ceremonial loan. Then the pattern hardened. Quiet briefings suggested a historic diamond tiara, valued by experts at upwards of $15 million, had been lined up for a discreet sale. That suggestion struck directly at memory, duty, and the question of who guards the nation's heirlooms when the monarch is gone. At the center of the pushback stood Princess Anne. Known for discipline and economy of words, she did not raise her voice. She raised documents, movement logs, photographs, statements from long-time household staff. The focus was narrow but explosive. Pieces strongly associated with Elizabeth II and with the continuity the late Queen represented. The names alone carry weight. The Vladimir tiara, with its interchangeable pearl and emerald drops. The Girls of Great Britain and Ireland tiara, familiar from countless portraits. Queen Mary's fringe tiara, a spiked shimmer once worn by Elizabeth as a bridal diadem. The Greville emerald kokoshnik, bold and unmistakable. The lover's knot, all bows and suspended pearls, a silhouette forever linked in the public imagination with Diana and now Catherine. As the file grew, so did the stakes. This was no longer about one glittering headline item. The dossier tracked routes and timings, items signed out for valuation or maintenance, items moved at night under insured cover, items logged to temporary custody at a private address in Wiltshire. In each case, the question was the same. Was this standard conservation practice, or an attempt to shield crown-linked property from institutional oversight? A counter-narrative formed immediately around Queen Camilla. Sources close to her pointed to routine processes: reappraisal for insurance, structural checks, gem tightening, surface cleaning. They emphasize security protocols that require low-visibility transfers and non-public holding sites. They drew a line between crown-regulated heirlooms and personal chattels, a line that, they argued, is often complex in any monarchy given decades of gifts, loans, and family use. They also challenged the photographic matches circulating in the shadows, noting that auction houses sometimes use stock images, and that superficial similarities in design can lead observers astray. In this telling, Raymil House was a transit node, not a vault of secrets. The response was cool and legalistic. Nothing here, the statement implied, exceeds the limits of good faith stewardship. Anne's circle answered with method. They leaned on techniques familiar to gemologists and museum registrars: stone fluorescence signatures, old repair seams, idiosyncrasies in settings. They plotted dates and destinations, testing each explanation against paperwork. They mapped which pieces, by their design and provenance, fall under what insiders called the Royal Heritage Governance Code, a framework used by curators to distinguish between state regalia, entailed heirlooms tied to the crown, and purely personal effects. Under that framework, movement of crown-linked pieces triggers documentation, board-level acknowledgement, and a strict prohibition on extended storage at private residences. The names of the tiaras mattered here not for glitz, but for classification. The very fact these pieces are iconic is precisely why they are not treated as casual family jewels. Then came the paper that changed the atmosphere in every room where this quarrel was discussed. Among Elizabeth's personal documents, preserved at Balmoral, was a sealed letter naming Anne as the guardian responsible for safeguarding her jewels in trust for future generations, with explicit caution against repurposing or reassigning them. It was not a legal instrument in the courts of law sense. It was, however, a verdict in the court that matters to this family. Legacy. With that letter, Anne's position shifted from concerned relative to designated custodian. The temperature rose inside Clarence's house. According to those present, Anne laid out her case in steady beats. Photos of pieces in use, photos of settings dismounted, photos of cases in transit, logs that mirrored the photos, shipping entries that aligned with quiet catalogue listings for high-value stones and historical mounts, showing up in European and Gulf auctions under anonymous sellers, and then the contradiction at the heart of the counter-narrative. If images were stock and movements routine, why did schedules for conservation fail to match the internal maintenance calendar? And why did multiple consignments end with a private custody notation? Camilla's side fought on. The defense emphasized noise in the data. Misfiled stamps, duplicate numbers, old labels reused by habit. They pointed to the ambiguity around the lover's knot lineage, where versions and adaptations can confound even trained eyes. They argued that a tiara like the Vladimir, with its modular drops, could be misidentified when elements are swapped out for conservation or portrait styling. And they reminded the room that the late Queen herself sometimes treated certain jewels with the informality of personal wardrobe, blurring lines that staff must now reconstruct. Anne advanced on procedure. She insisted the line is not defined by habit, but by category, and categories are defined by history. The Royal Heritage Governance Code sections were read into the record. State regalia and entailed heirlooms are non-transferable, subject to independent curatorial review for every movement, and barred from storage in non-institutional vaults except in declared emergency. Loans require agreements. Restorations require before and after imaging and a registrar's audit. Whistleblowers are protected. In this environment, she said, personal practice yields to written process. Beyond the chamber, the narrative widened. Commentators weighed in on the symbolic pressure of the Girls of Great Britain and Ireland tiara. Too public, too photographed, too bound to Elizabeth's image to vanish even temporarily without explanation. Curators noted that the distinctive fringe construction of Queen Mary's diadem makes it unusually identifiable, including telltale spacing between spikes. Jewelers remarked that the Greville Emerald Kokoshnik's central stone and Russian-inspired arc are not easily confused with other pieces. These are signatures. They are not masks. A dispute over jewels has become a test of governance. A sealed letter now sits like a gavel over competing stories. Who signed off the movement orders? What does the king choose when family loyalty collides with institutional duty? Does a custodian's mandate outweigh palace habit? And if it does, which tiara will surface next, and where? Movement orders were stamped, cases were sealed. A courier van left a side gate under guard and did not return on schedule. That is where tonight's file opens. On paper trails that resist the airbrush, a shipment labelled for valuation bypassed the listed conservation facility and routed to a private Wiltshire address. The notation on the line item was simple and unsettling: private custody. Before this broke the surface, the palace calendar looked ordinary. An exhibition request had been logged for summer, a short-term loan penciled for a diplomatic reception. Nothing about that schedule explained why an emerald tiara associated with Queen Mary's Kokoshnik style or a fringe diadem long tied to Elizabeth's bridal history would be offline for weeks without registrar sign-off. The internal help desk email, CC'd to a junior registrar and quickly recalled, asked the question nobody wanted in writing. Who approved the detour? Enter the witnesses. A former butler described the late-night loadout in plain terms. Velvet-lined boxes. Temperature tags. No conversation, just signatures. A protection officer, long retired, confirmed the pattern. Non-standard pickup times. Routes that zigzagged around routine security nodes. A bonded jeweler, speaking on background, identified the telltale wobble in an old hinge of the Vladimir frame visible in one photograph, an anomaly documented in the archive. "These are not abstractions," the expert said. "These are fingerprints." The counterposition held its line. Camilla's office framed the movements as prudent and temporary. Conservation can be noisy, they argued. Insurance can be unforgiving. Discretion is security. The statement emphasized a boundary. Some pieces fall under personal chattels, others under institutional trust. Without the full catalogue before the public, the argument continued, confusion is inevitable. That boundary is the hinge on which the entire story swings. Anne did not try to win headlines. She tried to win the ledger. Her team reconstructed a timetable. When the girls of Great Britain and Ireland tiara was last photographed, when its replica was pulled for a museum dressing, when a similar frame appeared in a trade catalogue abroad under an anonymous seller, identified only by dimensions and a historical note that closely echoed a passage from the Royal Archive. The plot points aligned too neatly for coincidence. The cut of the upper festoons, the spacing of the diamonds, the weight class noted in an insurance rider 2 years earlier. Inside Clarence House, the exchange was clinical. Anne presented the Royal Heritage Governance Code like a checklist: regalia and entailed heirlooms, non-transferable, extended storage at private residences, prohibited, loan agreements, required and logged, before and after imaging, mandatory, whistleblower protections, explicit. Camilla's counsel replied that the code presumes clear classification, and classification, they said, is precisely what is under review. If the lover's knot in question is a later iteration, the counsel argued, the code's entailed provisions may not apply. If the Vladimir's drop configuration was altered for maintenance, identification based on old photos is compromised. The tension sat on one word: if. Anne's side pushed beyond silhouettes. They produced fluorescence tests, archival notes from a decade-old repair. A micro-scratch near a mounting screw on the fringe diadem's third spike from center, an imperfection museum staff had memorized because it photographs as a glint under hard light. They produced the sealed letter from Elizabeth II. It did not list pieces. It did not pretend to be a deed. It named a duty. It described a trust. It warned against repurposing heirlooms for personal ends. In a family where subtext is policy, that letter reads like statute. Public pressure tightened. Analysts on air mapped the emotional stakes. The girls of Great Britain and Ireland tiara is not simply diamonds, it is a shorthand for an era. The Greville Emerald Kokoshnik is not simply a green blaze, it is the visible memory of continuity through decades of headwinds. When objects like these change context without explanation, the story told to the public fractures. Viewers do not need gemology to detect a broken narrative. Then a packet surfaced. Redacted emails from a shipping broker referenced matching inserts for a continental lot, a phrase consistent with resetting stones to obscure origin before sale. An auction house, pressed for comment, denied consignments tied to any royal provenance and cautioned against speculation. But the dates in the email aligned with the courier detour and with an internal request to pull mount images from the digital register pending review. The pattern now had more than rumor, it had overlaps. Camilla's media allies advanced a sharper defense. They accused Anne's camp of criminalizing conservation. They suggested rivalries are being laundered as policy. They asked why a guardian named by a personal letter should outrank a consort in practice. And they pointed to precedent. Monarchs have historically treated jewels fluidly, moving pieces between public and private use without public consultation. Tradition is not a spreadsheet, one columnist wrote. Anne's allies answered with the one currency that tradition respects: precedent with paper. They cited memoranda from prior reigns where specific items, by description, not just sentiment, were ring-fenced as heirlooms bound to the institution, not the individual. They noted that modern governance, post-digital, expects traceability that did not exist in earlier decades. Legacy now travels with metadata. When that metadata is interrupted, alarm bells ring. At this hour, two realities coexist. In one, A queen consort navigates a messy archive and a blur of categories while trying to safeguard high-value items under difficult conditions. In the other, a custodian with a mandate watches crown-linked heirlooms drift into private channels, reappear as anonymized lots, and return only when cornered by documentation and daylight. The difference between these realities is not a matter of taste, it is a matter of proof. A van can be explained, a detour can be explained, even a missing hinge can be explained. But who authorizes the exception that becomes the rule? When the jewelry tells the same story as the paperwork, and the paperwork points away from the registry, what remains for talk to fix? And if the ledger is finally read out in full, who carries the cost of every unaccounted mile? Balmoral was chosen not for sentiment, but for control. Fewer cameras, tighter rosters, rooms that remember who speaks and who stays silent. Invitations were issued as schedules, not summons. The king, the queen consort, Princess Anne, a registrar, 2 curators, and legal counsel on both sides. The file travelled in hard copy. Devices were surrendered at the door. A single rule governed the meeting. Every claim would be tethered to a page. Proceedings opened with inventory. Anne began not with accusation but with enumeration. 5 tiaras, named and described with the precision of a museum label. The Vladimir tiara, modular drops, alternating pearl and emerald options, a hairline stress near one hinge documented after a historic remount. The Girls of Great Britain and Ireland tiara, festooned frame, distinctive scallop profiles along the upper row. Queen Mary's fringe, 47 spikes, third from center showing a micro-abrasion encircled in past conservation images. The Greville Emerald Kokoshnik, a central emerald with a visible jardin under magnification, a hallmark of its natural inclusions. The Lover's Knot, arched bows with suspended pear, shaped pearls, later pearls documented as replacements in the late 20th century. Photos were placed, one by one, next to movement orders and conservation logs. Camilla's counsel countered with process. The Vladimir's drops can be swapped. Identification errors multiply when mounts travel separately, they said. The fringe has replicas for high-risk engagements. Mixing image sets would confound timelines. The Kokoshnik's central stone, they argued, had been removed temporarily for micro-setting stabilization, an absence that could have fueled false sightings. The Lover's Knot lineage is notoriously layered, original, adaptations, and modern adjustments. The point was not to deny motions, but to dilute certainty. Across the table, the king kept his hands folded, his eyes moving only when dates were read aloud. Anne's side pivoted to the Royal Heritage Governance Code, introduced as governance, not theatre. A curator read short sections in measured tones. Entailed heirlooms are non-transferable. Extended storage at private residences is prohibited. Loans require written agreements. All movements must be co-signed by the guardian of the jewels and logged by the registrar. Exceptions are filed and reviewed at the next board meeting. Whistleblower protections are in force. A second curator traced signatures on the movement orders displayed. A series of initials matched to conservation staff, none belonging to Anne as guardian, none co-signed by the board. On a separate sheet lay the private custody notations. The curators did not editorialize. They asked for the exemptions file. Camilla's counsel produced a folder labeled Operational Flex. Inside were memos citing compressed timelines, heightened security warnings, and insurance conditions requiring discreet handling. One memo invoked temporary off-site placement at a controlled private location due to risk posture, a phrase that left the curators stone still. It was language for art evacuated during crisis, not for jewels commuting to a country house. The registrar pointed to missing countersignatures, querying whether risk posture triggers had been formally recorded. The answer was procedural. Assessments exist, but they are classified. The registrar asked, then who classifies them, and under what authority? Evidence deepened. A shipping broker's redacted email referenced matching inserts for a continental lot. A diagram sketched the removal of pearls from arched bows and their reseating in a neutral mount, a common laundering tactic for provenance-blind sales. An auction house denial was placed beside a catalogue description that mimicked, nearly word for word, an internal archive note on the Girls of Great Britain and Ireland festoons. One by one, the overlapping dates began to align. The courier detour, the deregistration flag, the catalogue's anonymous lot preview. Camilla spoke briefly, and for the first time directly. She said the line between institutional and personal had been hazed by practice over decades, that she followed security and insurance advice, that she never ordered a sale of any crown-linked piece. She acknowledged instructing staff to minimize chatter and to expedite movements. She said Raymill had been used for privacy and safety. She said it was never intended as a vault. She looked toward the king only once, on the words privacy and safety. Anne answered without raising tempo. She read from the sealed letter found at Balmoral, short, clear sentences about duty and trust, about guarding for those who come after. She did not call it law. She called it the instrument by which the family understands itself. Then she placed a photo of the fringe third spike from center, the glint, the micro-scratch, the archived circle in red pen. She asked the registrar to confirm that the scratch was first noted a decade earlier, then asked whether the same mark appears on the item photographed during the valuation transit to Raymill. The registrar, careful, slow, confirmed it did. The king asked one question. Who had authority to override the guardian's co-signature requirement? The room did not answer in words. It answered in crossed glances and paper shuffle silence. The registrar repeated the question in technical terms and pointed again to the missing exemptions file. Counsel for Camilla reiterated classification, risk posture, and the historic flexibility that previous sovereigns enjoyed. Counsel for Anne replied with a sentence that hung in the rafters. Sovereign flexibility is not a license to erase the ledger. Outside the closed chamber, phones vibrated in pockets they were not supposed to be in. A broadcaster cited Balmoral deliberations. A columnist floated the possibility of a formal audit. A museum director, off record, warned that if entailed pieces could be rerouted without board oversight, every national collection is vulnerable to precedent. Inside, the curators requested immediate repatriation to institutional custody for any item currently off-site without duly signed exemptions. Camilla's counsel asked for time. Anne answered with a clock, the exact hours each tiara had been off the registrar's grid. When documents run out of euphemism, choices arrive. Does the king back a consort's claim of necessary discretion or a sister's mandate for traceability? Does the palace publish a list of entailed heirlooms or double down on secrecy and trust? And, if one sealed letter can reframe a crown's unwritten rules, what else waits in the archives with sentences short enough to decide a future? Phones lit up before the cars left the estate. The phrase private custody broke containment and landed on news desks. The words guardian of the jewels trended within the hour. What had been a document fight became a public reckoning. Anchor's recap mapped the 5 tiaras on studio screens, tracing silhouettes viewers already knew by heart. The shorthand was simple: continuity versus control. A joint statement from the Palace Communications Office tried to lower the temperature. It referenced conservation standards, security advice, historic practice, and the need to protect sensitive catalogue data. It did not address the missing exemptions file, the unsanctioned off-site storage, or the registrar's absence from key signatures. The silence functioned like an answer. Commentators read it as a bid for time and space. Critics read it as an admission without the words. The counter-narrative sharpened. Voices aligned with Camilla argued that jewelry in constant ceremonial rotation must move quickly, often invisibly, that secrecy is a feature, not a flaw, that the notion of an inflexible, museum-style regime ignores a living court's realities. They cited examples from prior reigns where pieces crossed the line between personal and institutional without blowback. They pointed out that Anne's letter, moral as it may be, does not rewrite the constitution of the crown. Anne's position did not require rewriting anything, it required reading. Her allies placed governance at the centre. The Royal Heritage Governance Code, a registrar's log, a board's co-signature. They argued that the very fame of the girls of Great Britain and Ireland Tiara and the Fringe makes them ineligible for casual handling. If tradition is invoked, they said, then let tradition be documented, not improvised. A new cluster of documents reached journalists by mid-afternoon, insured values, rider updates, and one email thread referring to a continental lot where matching inserts would be used to seat pearls in a neutral frame. The implication was clear. Remove identifying elements, break the narrative continuity, and a historic piece can be disassembled into anonymous components. An auction house repeated its denial, noted strict compliance protocols, and suggested that conspiratorial readings help nobody. Yet the dates in the thread were unforgiving. They matched the courier's detours and the internal order to pull certain images from the digital register, pending review. Then came an intervention from outside the room but inside the story's heart. Prince Harry released excerpts of letters written by his mother, Diana. One passage referred to a pearl bracelet and to concerns that personal items might be absorbed into an inventory to which the original family had no access. The language did not name a tiara, it did not have to. Public attention swung back to the lover's knot, the piece most bound to Diana in the popular imagination. The effect was accelerant. Emotional memory combined with procedural doubt and pushed the news cycle into overdrive. Museums weighed in, carefully. Directors spoke about provenance as a public trust. Curators reminded audiences that high-value heritage follows chain of custody standards identical in spirit, whether the institution is a palace or a gallery. Former registrar staff, now academic, described how tiny, idiosyncratic marks, like the micro-scratch on the fringe, anchor identity more reliably than photographs in isolation. The subtext was plain. If the marks match, the story becomes fact. Inside the palace apparatus, process began to move. A discreet call went out to schedule a limited audit, framed as routine but assigned to an external museum professional known for blunt reports. The task list included reconciling movement orders, confirming the location of entailed heirlooms, and reviewing any use of private residences as off-site placements. A second track opened a channel to insurers, requesting confirmation of every rider triggered in the past 18 months. That channel, once open, could not be closed without leaving a print. Camilla's office made a strategic pivot. Instead of all-purpose denials, it proposed a curated disclosure, a supervised viewing for the registrar and board at an institutional vault, confirming custody of the 5 headline tiaras while reserving all arguments about classification. The offer sounded like de-escalation. Anne's camp answered with terms. The viewing must include before and after imaging, current condition reports, and restoration notes for any dismounted elements. They added one sentence that changed the negotiation. Items currently off-site must return to institutional control before any optics. Public sentiment tracked the negotiations like a scoreboard. Pollsters reported sharp movement on a single question: who should set the rules, habit or code? Security analysts added a separate caution. If the palace signals that domestic private sites can function as temporary vaults, copycat theft risks rise. Insurance specialists nodded. Ambiguity invites loss. A small detail broke through the noise. A conservator noted that the Vladimir's emerald drops, when swapped for pearls, leave minute impressions on the mount over time, impressions that can be seen only under raking light. A photograph from the valuation transit showed those impressions. The conservator's comment was measured. Mounts remember their stones. If so, the mount itself becomes testimony. By evening, the lines were drawn in institutional ink. A board vote was scheduled on emergency provisions. Temporary suspension of all private off-site placements for entailed heirlooms. Publication of a redacted list of items classified under the code. Appointment of an external auditor for a 90-day review. Camilla's counsel warned of security exposures should lists go public, suggested codename cataloging instead, and pressed for a carve-out, recognizing the consort's operational discretion. Anne's counsel returned to the single missing piece, the exemptions file. If it exists, produce it. If it does not, the code stands unbroken. A monarchy can survive noise. It struggles with silence where a signature should be. What signature authorized the detours? Who accepted accountability when the ledger shows blank spaces? And if the doors of an institutional vault swing open tomorrow with cameras waiting outside, what exactly will be counted, and what will never be seen again? The vault doors opened at dawn. Not a flourish, not a ceremony, just the clank of institutional metal and a registrar's clipboard ticking through names that had become battlefield code. Vladimir, Girls of Great Britain and Ireland. Queen Mary's Fringe, Greville Emerald Kokoshnik, Lovers Not. Cameras waited outside the perimeter. Inside, the board, the guardian, and the curators stood beneath cold lights and asked the only question that matters: where are they? And in what state? One by one, cases were unlatched. The Vladimir frame, its modular drops seated with pearls, showed the familiar hinge stress noted years ago. Under raking light, the mount bore the faint impressions of emerald drops long alternated on and off, fingerprints only a bench jeweler loves. The Girls of Great Britain and Ireland tiara rested heavy, its upper scallops matching the registry's millimeter spacing. The fringe revealed, under magnification, the micro-scratch on the third spike from center. The conservator encircled it anew in red pen. The Kokoshnik's central emerald flashed jarred in as expected, the inclusions mapping the way a river maps a valley. The Lover's Knot presented its arched bows and suspended pearls, with documentation acknowledging a prior replacement cycle decades earlier. Condition reports were taken. Imaging was logged. Signatures landed where silence once stood. Repatriation did not erase the paper trail. The board voted unanimously to suspend private off-site placements for entailed heirlooms until an external audit concludes. The registrar received emergency authority to freeze movements that lack co-signature by the guardian. A redacted inventory of entailed pieces, item descriptions without sensitive measurements, was slated for publication alongside a governance explainer. Camilla's counsel secured one concession: codename cataloging to protect security, paired with a commitment to disclose categories, not hiding places. In the vocabulary of institutions, that is a line held and a face saved. The exemptions file remained the live wire. After hours of cross-reference, a thin folder materialized, patchy, incomplete, more apology than record. It cited compressed timelines, insurance stipulations, and risk posture assessments authorized by a senior office holder, whose title named responsibility without identifying a signature. The registrar read it twice, then said what the ledger requires. The code anticipates emergencies. It does not authorize ambiguity. The folder was logged as non-compliant and forwarded to the auditor. Camilla made a final statement on paper. She reiterated that no crown-linked piece was ever intended for sale, that Raymill functioned as a shield in a hostile climate, that historic habits blurred lines she believed were workable. She pledged cooperation with the audit. It was measured, somber, and careful to anchor itself in security rather than entitlement. Anne issued no statement. She did not need one. The sealed letter had spoken in sentences short enough to carry across generations, and the day's signatures had translated those sentences into procedure. Public reaction moved in two waves. Relief, first. The headline items exist, intact. Then insistence, governance, not personalities, must carry the weight from here. Curators reminded audiences that heritage is not truly safe until the rules that guard it become dull, predictable, and boring. Analysts noted a political reality. Transparency that would have been unthinkable a decade ago now looks like the price of legitimacy. Polling suggested broad support for the board's measures and for the registrar's new latitude. The phrase "guardian of the jewels" ceased trending and settled into something steadier, a job description. By evening, the audit terms were fixed. 90 days. Full reconciliation of movement orders against physical checks. Review of security advisories that invoked private placements. Confirmation of any component-level removals, pearls, drops, mounts, and their return to original contexts. A recommendation on publishing a permanent, redacted heirloom index. The king affixed his name to the order. It was not a speech, it was a signature. The story closes where responsibility begins, with a ledger tightened, a vault resealed, and a family reminded that legacy is a system, not a sentiment. No arrests, no perp walk, no cinematic confession, just the slow, institutional click of rules reasserting themselves over rooms that like to run on whispers. The jewels returned. The trust will take longer. But under the glare of documentation, habit gives way to code, and code gives the public the one thing rumors cannot: terms. You've stayed with us through a complicated file, and your attention matters. If this kind of accountability reporting and heritage coverage is valuable to you, please subscribe, hit the bell, and share this broadcast with someone who follows the crown. Drop your questions in the comments. Which governance step strikes you as most important? And what safeguard would you add to protect national heirlooms from necessary exceptions? Thank you for watching.